are live from Washington, and good evening to everyone in China and other parts of the world. I am Julia Chang-Block, founding president of the U.S.-China Education Trust, and very happy to be with you all for the third webinar in our virtual U.S. election series, Media Impact on the 2020 U.S. Elections, Professionalism, Partisanship, and Pandemic. And we are delighted that AmCham China is once again joining us as a co-sponsor of this popular series. I'm just taking a few minutes to open the program and introduce a new partner, the Fortunias Society of Macau, represented today by Professor Mei Wu of the University of Macau. Professor Wu is a founding member of the Department of Communication and the MA program in Communication and New Media at the University of Macau. She specializes in media technology and communication studies and is widely published. She was a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford Internet Institute and visiting research fellow at the East Asia Institute, National University of Singapore. Her research interests also cover journalism and globalization, with a focus on press systems in Southeast Asia. Professor Wu also serves as the president of the Asia Pacific Communication Exchange Association and is one of the founding members of the Fortunias Society, dedicated to the promotion of multiculturalism and global citizenship. Let me turn to Professor Wu to make a few remarks. Henry Tan of AmCham China will follow Professor Wu and introduce today's moderator, Jim McGregor, whom I think most of us know. Enjoy the program, everyone.
So you want me or you want Harry?
Professor Wu, I think you have the floor now.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to thank Julia and the U.S.-China Education Fund for jointly organizing this timely and a very significant webinar on the media impact on the U.S. presidential election this year. And first, I would like to have a few words introducing our Fortuna Society Macau. This society was recently established in Macau with a group of professionals, academics in Hong Kong, Macau, and the Guangdong areas, which is recently labeled as a Greater Bay Area. So our mission is to maintain the momentum of globalization and the multiculturalism and world peace. And we also find that it's currently the U.S.-China relations, particularly the rhetoric in both sides about these hardliners, it's dangerous for us, especially for Macau, where we have this heavy U.S. investment. And also, I think there is a good relations between China and U.S. and form the foundation for the prosperity of Macau. And so that's why we're very concerned about this currently, the rhetoric of these hardliners on both sides. So that is, we are very interested in organizing this webinar on the media impact with the U.S. elections. And because our society, we have a group of academics and young scholars around the Greater Bay areas that are very interested in this topic. My few words, and I give a floor for Harry and all the other specialists. Thank you very
much. Julia, thank you very much for the introduction, and also Professor Wu Mei, and appreciate your elaboration on your research background too. And when I was talking about the potential opportunity of working with you, in addition to our existing partnership with USET, I think what I elaborated with our USET colleagues is we very much appreciate the third view aside from what's dominant in mainland China and also in Washington, to add to our bilateral relations related discussions. So, along with all of our audience today, I believe I myself personally also looking forward to the learning. And also, let me turn to the audience and all our friends who are speakers today. By way of introduction, my name is Henry Tan. I'm a Senior Director at AmCham China, looking after our programs and services in our offices in Beijing, Tianjin, Dalian, Shenyang, and Wuhan. So on behalf of our President Al Bibi, who moderated the previous session on business, trade, and economy of this presidential election series, let me once again thank you, Ambassador Julia Chan Block, our speakers today, and the USET, and our teams from both of our organizations for making this partnership possible and also continued. This partnership is very vital, in my view, to our AmCham China's membership to acquire knowledge on the megatrends that affect the world economy and their business decisions. Every year at AmCham China, we invest in tremendous efforts to understand the impact to business from momentums on the Chinese and US political calendars. For example, the two sessions, Central Economic Work Conference, and so on. And similarly, we conduct our annual door knocks to Washington that Jim and Julia, you are both familiar with, to communicate the facts that represent our membership's viewpoints to Congress, the administration, and the academia. However, of course, compared to all of those, no attention we pay supersedes what we do to political processes that facilitates transition of power, such as the US presidential election that we're covering today. Actually, I would not like to take too much time away from our excellent lineup of speakers because they have been long pioneered observations of the US elections and also the US-China relations. However, I do like to note that the reasons many organizations such as AmCham China and USET do what we do are that between our two countries, there ought to be many channels to communicate and understand each other, especially nowadays when, in my personal view, our two governments are not communicating as well as they used to. So the very few channels for us to learn from each other, including media, which is the focal point of our discussion today, seems to be carried away by emotion, unfortunately, on both sides of the issue. So that's why I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. That also said, I'm glad that we're focusing on media as a standalone topic out of many of the programs that we have done and we will do. Many at AmCham China have long advocated to be more proactive with our media friends, not just to work more closely with our media friends as outlets of our messages, but also to apply the learning from media to our advocacy work and also business decisions, both in our services to members and also in our communications with governments. So, so to end, what I would like to say is, I think today's program will help us make distinctions amongst what are campaign rhetorics and perhaps the so-called fake news, and also help us to be maybe more closer to what can be the true stories. For without the level of wisdom and capability of understanding, there will be no right judgment. And without right judgment, it can be dangerous in the foreseeable rocky roads ahead of us for our two countries. That, I believe, is a common question that we're yet to be able to answer in both a society where the information can be a little too abundant, and also a society where the flow of information can be somewhat limited. For the speakers today, our member companies have pre-submitted a pool of very interesting questions, and personally, I look forward to learning together. And one last note, Ambassador Block and Jim and our speaker friends, is that obviously, and also personally, our two organizations working together is also very dear to my heart. So it gives me the opportunity to continue learning from Ambassador Block Yu and your team. And make my small contributions to our two countries' bilateral relations, and also help to make it healthy between us. And also for my peers and those who are younger, and hope this opportunity gives them some confidence to their career concerning our two countries' partnerships going forward. So with that, I would like to hand the time to our moderator today, Jim McGregor, who I believe is very familiar to our community, both at USET and also AmCham China. And so I'll save some time for the introduction and give it to Jim. Jim?
Thanks a lot, Henry. Well, I'm sitting in northern Minnesota here. I'm not in China right now, and there's a rainstorm outside. So if you see lightning, that's what's going on. I'm very, very happy to be able to do this. The people on this panel are really the top of political journalism, and some very legendary people, actually. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we will have about 5 to 10 minute presentation by each of them. Joy will be a little longer because she's going to do a PowerPoint, and then we'll get into some good discussion and Q&A. So let me start with Joey Chun. She's the director of Medill Northwestern University's program in Washington, D.C. She hosted America Tonight for Al Jazeera. She works with a company called Way Forward Media for a branding consulting company. And prior to this, she was a CBS News correspondent based in D.C., covering the White House and Capitol Hill. She's a longtime anchor and correspondent for CNN and CNN International. She's the winner of 2 National Emmy Awards, a Gerald Loeb Award in financial journalism, and we're very, very happy to have Joy with us here today. Next, we have Ron Elving, the senior editor and correspondent for NPR in Washington. He also is a lecturer at the School of Public Affairs for American University. He's also taught at George Mason and Georgetown. His background goes kind of up the whole ladder of covering politics in Washington. He was political editor for USA Today and for Congressional Quarterly. He's the author of the book Conflict and Compromise: How Congress Makes Laws. For 15 years, he headed up NPR's Washington desk. He's received many awards, including the Dirksen Award for Congressional Reporting, the Edward R. Murrow Award from Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and he first went to Washington in '84 as a congressional fellow. Ron, thank you for joining us today. And then Fred Barnes, who is well, I guess he's a legend, actually. No one wants to be called a legend, but this guy is. When I was a reporter in the press gallery during the Reagan administration for Knight Ridder, Fred was already one of the big shots you kind of looked up to when he walked in the room. He's now a senior columnist at the Washington Examiner, appears on Fox News. He's executive editor and a co-founder of the Weekly Standard. He was senior editor, White House correspondent for New Republic, Baltimore Sun, Washington Star. He's been through many publications over the years. 10 years he was on the McLaughlin Group. Fred, thanks a lot for joining us today. I'll now turn to Joey, who's got a PowerPoint. She's going to get us started with this PowerPoint and an overview of the topics we will be addressing today.
Jim, thank you so much. I appreciate your introduction, so kind. I also want to give my thanks to Fortunius. I really think that your work is important, and I want to applaud you for what you are doing. Also, my thanks to AmCham China, and of course to USET and Ambassador Julia Chang Block for the invitation to speak with you all today. It's morning here in DC, of course, and so if I'm looking like I might need my coffee, there's probably a reason for that. Our discussion today, they tell me, is media impact on the US elections, but I often feel it's the political environment that has impact on the media, frankly, at this point. You know, US news coverage is really quite inextricably linked to what is happening in the political environment at any time, but certainly in an election year, in a presidential election year, and in a year where, quite frankly, where we're at this moment is just 64 days away from what is likely to be one of the most consequential presidential elections in history. And I think sometimes there's hyperbole in US news coverage where we say, oh, this is the biggest election. This really is an enormous election with enormous consequences ahead. And I think that my colleagues on this panel agree with me and will share with you that never before has China been so much a part of the dialogue, so much a part of the political conversation. It is at the forefront of the US campaign news and therefore at the forefront of headlines and news coverage of all types in the United States. They are just so tied together. In fact, just last week, those relationships between Washington and Beijing became just a major and repeated focus of almost every speech at the Republican National Convention. This is Mr. Trump's party, the Republican Party. And that election, that convention was held just last week. And really at the top of that, even before the convention began, as Mr. Trump's second term agenda was announced, you'll see that there was a very big section relative to the rest of the agenda, ending our reliance on China. It was considered to be something that was right up front and center in the second term agenda plans of Mr. Trump. Among other priorities, the resolution to do something of a carrot and stick approach, frankly, looking at the trade relations between the United States and China and trying to encourage the return of jobs to the United States. Mr. Trump right up front saying that he would want tax credits for US companies that bring their manufacturing back from China to the States. And also a bit of a warning that stick against US companies that have invested too much money outside the States, offering tax credits for companies that bring back jobs, and then saying that there would be no further federal government contracts for companies who outsource to China. So pretty clear warning about that. Of course, this all comes against the backdrop of the discussions about the trade agreement and the phase one of the US-China trade deal, which there have been many assurances made, as you've seen in recent weeks, about upholding the phase one agreement, that it would go forward with China holding up its end of the pledge to buy $200 billion worth of US goods in the next 2 years, as the two sides clearly are trying to signal that they both want an end to the trade war. Beyond trade, though, the president also has aimed some very sharp words against China, blaming it regarding the pandemic. Mr. Trump's plans in that second term agenda really made a rather bold statement. He is saying that they want to hold China fully accountable. This is a quote, hold China fully accountable for allowing the virus to spread all around the world. This is his comment that he made the other day. Oh, I hope you could hear that. I did not hear it. But Mr. Trump said quite clearly, we are fighting off, in his words, we are fighting off the horrible thing that was delivered by China. And I let them know we're never going to forget it. He was quite firm in his language about that. Mr. Trump, of course, as you probably are aware, is quite firm in many of the things that he says, or maybe all of the things he says. He said he believes that it is clear to him that his opponent from the Democratic Party, the former US Vice President Joe Biden, is someone he said would be weak on China. And he's expressed his concern about that also at the convention last week. This is his statement about former Vice President Biden. What he was saying there, Mr. Trump said, China will own our country if this guy, referring to Mr. Biden, gets elected, and we can't let that happen. So the language, as you are probably accustomed to hearing, is quite aggressive and quite strong in Mr. Trump's views about China that he's expressing. For his part, Mr. Biden has signaled that he has opposed Mr. Trump's policies, particularly with regard to the tariffs. He sees them as having been unsuccessful in accomplishing their purpose, that is to support U.S. manufacturing and agriculture. But the former vice president has also taken quite a sharp tone against Beijing regarding civil liberties and political freedoms as well, even going so far as to have his campaign issue a statement using the word genocide, which, as you know, is quite loaded in reference to the situation in Xinjiang. The impact of all the political coverage about discussions with China has clearly had an impact with many Americans. And I just wanted to show you this research from the Pew Research Center here. In early March, Pew Research found that China's reputation had reached what it described then as an all-time low with Americans. 2/3 of those surveyed said they had a negative view of China, which sounded like a lot. But then in just a matter of weeks, from March until July, when the next survey was taken, that shot up to 73%, you see here. This is quite sharp. 73% of Americans say they hold an unfavorable view of China at this point. And what is the cause of that? Well, also in the surveys, nearly 80% of those surveyed say that China's early response and how it dealt with the pandemic was to blame for the spread of the novel coronavirus. So there is some link between what is in the political dialogue and what reaches Americans. And of course, it is reaching it through the US media as well. I want to say that there are other issues that have pushed China forward in the conversation in the American political sphere right now as well. Certainly, for those of us who work closely with university students, we are aware of this in the United States, the status of international students in the United States, and particularly Chinese students and those of Chinese descent. Some 370,000 Chinese students have been in the United States, were reported in the United States last academic year. If you know any of them, or if you have been one, you have probably heard that the visa situation for them has become rather precarious. Certainly there's also some caution about the visa situation in regards to Chinese nationals who seek to work in the United States. And then a subject that has concerned me personally a great deal, at some level for some personal reasons, the increasing violence against Asian Americans that we have seen in this country during this year, during the pandemic shutdown in particular. In this case, against Asian Americans who are sometimes singled out as Chinese, whether they are ethnically Chinese or not. In just 8 weeks of this year, more than 1,900 acts of anti-Asian violence were reported in the United States, and it actually initiated the start of a database. We never had a database like this before, but there has developed now a database, Stop API Hate, Asian American Pacific Islander hate, because of the large number of reports, not only verbal attacks, but actual physical attacks on Asian Americans on the ground in many cities in the United States. This is a very disturbing time and a very disturbing trend, and one I think that the Asian American community is just now trying to grapple with and trying to figure out how it should be handled. There is clearly a lot for us to discuss in all of this. We can't get to everything in just the hour plus that we have, but I did want to make the point that all these issues, the social issues, the social conflicts, the political dialogue, all of these things bring politics and media so closely together in the kind of information that is reaching the American public. It is so central when China has come to the front of so many conversations in politics in this country. And there's, I think, a real need for us to understand and to acknowledge how domestic politics and news coverage impacts this very, very critical relationship between the world's great powers. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, Jim.
Joey, that was great. Thank you so much for putting all the work into that. It was a great overview, and I would just like to second you on the Asian American discrimination and violence. It's very worrisome where this is all headed, because all my years in China, I've got a lot of friends that are facing this, and a lot of these students actually on campuses. So thank you for highlighting that. Ron Elving's now going to give us some historical context on elections, objectivity, and journalism. Please, Ron.
Thank you, Jim, and a pleasure to be with you all. Let me begin by saying it is a given in American politics today that we are a polarized country, but the question is often raised, particularly by historical scholars, are we more polarized than we have been in the past? And if so, why do we think so? If not, why do we think so despite the facts? And there has been some very good work done by people such as Morris Fiorina at Stanford University, who has delved into this question of polarization and are we really so polarized, and is there still a mainstream in America? It's interesting work, but there is a popular notion abroad in the land that we have somehow become more polarized than we've ever been before. And one reason that impression is so hard to shake is because the media are quite different from the attitude that many of us grew up with in the media. There is far less of a mainstream consensus. There is much more variety of viewpoint. Of course, most of that is probably due to the internet and the social media that have driven the current generation and its predecessors further and further away from traditional sources. And the traditional sources of news, some of us may be more nostalgic for them than others, but the traditional sources of news did have some degree of tendency to trend toward a center line, a sort of regression to the mean, an attempt to reach the mainstream. And there were hardcore economic reasons for that. So the historical context that I want to try to bring to this begins back in American Revolutionary times in the 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution. Early publishers in the 1700s in the United States, people such as Benjamin Franklin, Peter Zenger, they had a great deal of individual economic identification. In other words, they're doing their own thing. They were a mom and pop operation to a large degree. Printing on crude presses that involved a lot of hand labor, and then having the papers distributed for minimal cost by children, essentially. In the 19th century, all of that got a great deal better organized and more mechanized and more economically remunerative, because we discovered the wonders of advertising as a source of income for the media. And once we really got into commercial advertising, there was money to be made. And the larger your circulation, the more money there was to be made. And the most money was made by those who had dominant circulation. So if you were the #1 paper or the monopoly paper in a particular city or region, you made a great deal more money. And if you were the dominant news operation nationwide, you could make even more. And that phenomenon arose in the 20th century with radio and television broadcasting. And the idea that you were trying to get not just a sustainable audience, not just enough to get by, but you were literally trying to reach every pair of eyeballs in the entire country. And in order to do that, you needed to be a little less divisive in your delivery of the news. You didn't want to chase anyone out of the tent. You wanted as many people to feel comfortable with your product as possible. So this dovetailed as good economics for newspapers and then later radio and television, with the rise on the educational side of a philosophy of, if you will, objectivism. It was tied to a lot of other kinds of thinking, such as scientific thinking, reproducible results, laboratory testing. And the idea was that somehow that could all apply well and effectively to the seeking of political truth or to the seeking of social reality representations that we call journalism. So we got our first school of journalism, founded early in the 1900s at Columbia University, with some of the money left over from Joseph Pulitzer's career, which was not necessarily always what you would call a model of objective journalism. But nonetheless, the money was put to excellent use, same source as the Pulitzer Prizes. And that school today, along with Medill, and maybe one or two others, is really at the top of journalism education in the United States. I think you can certainly say that about Columbia and Medill. So the school idea was that you could bring the idea of objectifiable, provable fact to bear in journalism in a useful way. And that was also pretty useful to those publishers who were trying to make sure that everyone stayed in the tent. Way back to Benjamin Franklin's day, the political attitudes expressed by those independent operators, those individual entrepreneurs, those mom and pop operations, tended to be very personal, tended to be very much the viewpoint of the publisher personally. And they were very highly polarized, and they were highly partisan. Many early newspapers actually had the name of a political party in the name of the newspaper. Some of those still survive today, the Democratic Gazette and so forth. And this was typical, and this was expected, and most communities had several newspapers so they could have several points of political viewpoint. And that was considered normal for a very long time, until the advent of this real mass circulation idea and the driving out of the smaller operations by the mass operations. And now this reaches a kind of zenith, if you will, in the radio and television era, because then it became possible for a radio or television operation to literally, technically reach virtually everyone in the United States. And so everyone could tune in on the radio to one of the new broadcast networks. And when this came to television and had just this compelling power of visual as addition to words, you got in the 1970s a phenomenon where the 3 evening broadcasts for the news on ABC, CBS, and NBC were drawing an extraordinary audience of television viewers around the country. Before dinner, during dinner, after dinner, you sat down and watched the news, and then that led into your evening of entertainment programming. And in those years, in the 1970s, those 3 broadcasts, just 3 broadcasts, all coming from within a few blocks of each other in Midtown Manhattan, really, when you looked at the editorial control over all 3, had what we would call today a 50 rating and an 80 share. That means of all the televisions that were in use during those hours, 80% of them were watching one of those 3 broadcasts. Now, of course, there wasn't much else to watch in those days. You didn't have an infinitude of channels and options and things to watch on your screen. So you turned on the TV and you turned to one of those 3, and you got their view of the world. You got their view of the world whether you wanted it or not, whether you entirely bought into it or not. That's what you got. That began to decline a little bit in the 1980s as CNN began. It declined a good bit more in the 1990s when Fox News began in 1996. And today, they're down to a fraction of that same audience, something in the neighborhood of 12 to 15% rating and less than a 30% share. That is vastly different. And although ABC, CBS, and NBC carry on and still have very large audiences relative to, say, newspapers, and still very healthy in comparison to the cables, they occasionally are not even the most watched television for an event in the news. Oftentimes, Fox will have more viewers watching than the broadcasters, even though it is a cable subscription service. So those things have changed. And with that change and the rise of the internet and social media being the main way that the younger generations get linked to news stories, they don't sit down and type in the name of a news organization. They sit down and start conversing with their friends. And their friends say, look at this, and their friends say, look at that, and they link to what their friends are looking at. So because of all of that, the economics of our media have changed. The presumption that you're trying to get every pair of eyeballs in the country if you want to be profitable has been upended. And it is, again, in many respects, possible for a very small operation, almost a mom and pop operation, to get into the internet space and reach a large audience, large enough to support itself and become influential. And so we have many websites now that command attention. We have many websites now that especially younger news consumers trust, and trust as much or more than what their parents and grandparents used to watch. And that has contributed, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but that tremendous panoply of viewpoints, that tremendous panoply of sources has contributed to polarization in the sense that there is no longer a hardcore of news organizations trying to pull everybody into watching the same thing, or trying to pull everybody in with the idea of not excluding anyone from the tent. In fact, much to the contrary, many of these new sources of information, these new outlets, find that what works best for them economically is to be as provocative as possible, to be as far left as possible, as far right as possible, to come up with some kind of a theory that no one else has, and to try to sell that to a hardcore audience that will then be sufficient to support them economically. So in a sense, the partisanship, the polarization, the individual preeminence that we see in parts of the internet is in some respects a return to some of the ethos we had in the very early newspaper publishing in this country back in the 1700s. And with that, I'll invite your later questions and discussion and look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Well, that was great. Thanks so much. Just a couple comments. You talk about the 80 share that those networks had. The only place that still exists is China, where the CCT Evening News is the only thing on the channel. So anybody that's got TV on has to watch it. And I wonder what Walter Cronkite would have thought about being replaced by algorithms and bots out of Russia and elsewhere. I mean, how the world has changed, right? Fred, Fred's going to take a look at the evolution of the media and take us back to, focusing on the campaign and the upcoming election. So please take it away, Fred.
I certainly will. And I like talking about the media. It's something I've been doing for my adult life. And I've talked about getting a real job, but no, I've stuck with this. And really everything has changed in the media over the last 50 years. Particularly back 50 years ago, it was newspapers. That was the big thing. And towns in America had papers. A paper came out in the morning and a paper came out in the evening. And frequently more than one paper would come out in the morning and more than one in the evening. And then television came along. And television really stole a lot of the audience. And newspapers lost subscribers. A lot of them did. And then the internet came along a few years later. And then not only did newspapers lose subscribers, a lot of them went out of business. I mean, the internet has been just a powerful force in replacing newspapers. Now, I love newspapers. I get 3 of them every day in paper. They deliver them to my house, but you don't have to do that anymore because I think many people subscribe to newspapers, but they do it online. You can, and so you look it up in the morning. It's digital, and that's the easier way to a way to see it. And you don't have all, your hands don't get dirty from handling all these papers and so on. The media world now is really chaos because there's just so many different sources of information. You can get up in the morning and look, for instance, at there are things such as accumulators. And these are people who have websites and they accumulate stories from all types, from newspapers and from television and so on. And they can be very helpful. I look at one every morning when I get up. And it can be, it's just a completely different environment. And there's so many ways, not only that news is communicated, but are open for people to get and tap into news sources, and most of them for free. And it's just a completely different world now. But we have Facebook and we have something called Twitter. I don't know whether you around the world people are as familiar with Twitter as we are. Twitter is, you can be, if you're you send out messages of your own, and you can, and many people try to build up a huge audience that gets their so-called tweets every day. And what has really made tweets a big deal is there's one person in America who communicates almost every day, frequently more than once, by sending tweets. And of course, that's the president. He loves to tweet. It gets him in trouble frequently because one of the problems that the president has is is he likes to get in arguments with people. He likes to call them, quibble with them. He likes to say bad things about them, and his tweets get around, and his personality is not one that has been particularly appealing. And that's one of the problems he's had in elections. I think he's going to retreat some now from being on television all the time and sending that many tweets, but we'll see. Biden and Trump, I mean, what a pair running for president. You know, I mean, Biden has been humiliated twice before and not even getting close to winning the Democratic presidential nomination. But this time he really, I mean, Lady Luck was on his team, and he hit one primary in South Carolina where he had a lot of political strength. He'd been there a lot, and he's not from South Carolina, he's from Delaware, but and won there. And then a few days later, there were a bunch of primaries, and he won 10 out of 14 of those, and boom, he was going to be the Democratic presidential nominee. In just a matter of 3 or 4 days, the Democratic race turned around, and a guy in the primaries, you're supposed to do very well first in Iowa and then in New Hampshire. These have been the beginning of the nomination fights for in both the Democrats and the Republican Party, and Biden did poorly in both of them. But then came South Carolina a few weeks later, and so on, and now he's the Democratic nominee. Trump, of course, was a huge upset. When he won in 2016, because he'd never really been full-time in politics, that's for sure. He'd been in real estate in New York. That had been his business, of course. And then he dabbled in politics some, but ran a race in 2016. I think he could have run as a Democrat, but he became a Republican and won the nomination. Big upset over a lot of much better known and experienced Republican politicians. Now, he and Biden are going at it. Just beginning now, because, you know, Biden has been doing a lot of his political appearances on things like Zoom that I'm talking on now, and other people. But now, starting today, actually, Biden has said he's going to get out and really campaign a lot around the country in person. And be a more conventional Republican, rather Democrat, running for the presidency. Trump has been doing a lot of that too, and it's. I think it's going to be a pretty spicy race already. Speaking of China, Trump has called Biden the person who has sent all these jobs to China, sent American companies there where they would use Chinese workers, and that's where these companies would be. And now Trump is talking about, as Joy mentioned, to bring these jobs back. He's talked about bringing 1 million jobs back from China, jobs with American companies, but in China. 1 million, that's a lot. This is hard to do. That is a big change that he's talking about. No question about it. Well, in the next couple of weeks, I think that there are going to be 3 interesting changes or decisions made by Biden and Trump. Biden has to decide first, is he going to debate Trump in these 3 nationally televised debates that aren't required? You don't have to do it, but they've become sort of traditional now in presidential elections every 4 years. But already, and just a few days ago, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, said, she didn't think Biden ought to get into a debate with Trump on television. And because Trump was so bad, he was so mean to Hillary Clinton in their debates, 3 debates in 2016. So I think the first debate is something like September 29th. But Biden's going to have to decide whether he's going to go in those debates or not. And then he's going to also have to decide, well, how much does he really want to campaign? And we'll see. I mean, so the biggest issue in the campaign, China's not the biggest issue, but it is one, is Trump himself. Trump is one, and not just because he tweets, but he's in the media almost every day, more than once. He loves being in the media, loves being on television, loves being, just loves all the attention. And and he's going to have to decide. I think he's certainly been told, and I know I've written it, that when he's getting all this attention, that his personality in politics is not a winning personality, but his agenda and the changes he's made and the decisions he's made as president are something you can make a strong argument for, and he does. But if he's sticking his face on television day and night, and it hurts him. And so I think what he has to decide is, does he want to back away from that and talk about bigger issues and not just be quibbling on television with some other anybody, I mean, attacking people. He does what Richard Nixon said you shouldn't do, and that is shoot down. In other words, you criticize somebody who's at a much lower position in politics, say. So the race is close. Biden's ahead, but it really looks like Trump is picking up steam, and we'll see whether he can stop from hurting his own campaign. And I think he can. He did at the end of the race in 2016, but we'll see. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Fred. Sometimes it seems to me there's 3 candidates in this race. You got Trump and Biden going against each other, and then Trump and Biden both going against China. China's the 3rd candidate in some ways.
No, I'm surprised at that. Trump had already begun criticizing China, and he is really, I mean, his speech at the White House at the end of the Republican National Convention last Thursday was really, really tough on China. You know, one of the things you have to do is carry your transcript of it. And I have the president's speech here, and Joy referred to this, but Trump was talking about we will make America into the manufacturing superpower of the world. We will expand opportunity zones. We will, and this is particularly strong, we will end our reliance on China once and for all. Now, I don't think Trump can quite pull that off, but that is a very strong claim. And then, oddly enough, I don't think many people expected Biden to jump in and criticize China as much as he has, but particularly attacking Trump and saying Trump is the weak one in dealing with China, not Joe Biden, but Trump. And even some Democrats have wondered whether that's the best way to go for Biden. But you can see how China's emerged as an issue that both Biden and Trump are pounding on China.
Well, Biden's vulnerable on China because when he was vice president, he spent a lot of time with Xi Jinping. They traveled in America together, they traveled in China together, and there's clips of him saying nice things about China and Xi Jinping that can be weaponized in campaign commercials and are being weaponized. I'm gonna try to go through a couple themes here. One is the evolution of the American media and what it means for campaigns, but also then get into China. Let me start out by, I recently reread Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he looked, even in 85, he was looking ahead on how news and entertainment were merging. And we now are, especially in the era of ratings and clicks, everything is breaking news. I mean, how does this affect when, look, you're a columnist and you're supposed to be writing thoughtful things. Meanwhile, you're living in a blizzard every day of short attention span theater. I mean, how does the media maneuver with this, and what is the effect on our politics? I'll start with you, Fred, and then move on to the others.
Well, I think one of the big changes in the media now is, and one that's really just cropped up in the last, what would I say, maybe the last 20 years, and it's really intensified in this presidential election, that the media is more opinionated and more editorial in the stories that they write, and it's really been shown in the way they cover Trump. Most of the media is more liberal than conservative, and they don't like Trump and really pound him. And he pounds back, no question about that. And that's he calls these stories fake news, these opinionated stories, which there's so many of. It's I'm not sure that readers necessarily like that, but they sure get a lot of it, and it's really a different turn in the way presidential campaigns in particular are covered.
Yeah, Ron, what do you think about this, the whole issue of infotainment? I know you talked about the blizzard of news and the loss of gatekeepers, but what about the entertainment aspect of it? That's one of Trump's strengths. People may not like him, but they find him entertaining. You get up in the morning and say, what the hell did he say today?
Yes, he is a compelling figure. He's been the most compelling figure, not just of the last 5 years, but really in his own way. He crosses over more borders and gets into your life in more ways than any political figure I can remember. But look, here's the paradigm of what we're talking about. The paragon of what we're talking about is the late night television shows. We used to have shows that came on after prime time and after the late news with people like Johnny Carson. And they would come on and they might occasionally sort of step into politics a little bit, making fun of this politician or that politician. But there was a sense that they would only make a few political jokes. They would be mild and they would be not one-sided. Now, some of those comedians, late night people, had their own opinions, but they tried to keep that in check and they tried to appeal to the broadest audience possible. If you tune back into The Tonight Show now, if you tune back into any of the three major networks shows after the news late at night, depends on where you live, but East Coast comes on at 11:30, you are going to see something very different. These are now highly political shows. They talk about politics all the time. They are anti-Trump, and they are quite blatantly anti-Trump, and they go on about it at some length, and it is one of the mainstays of the programming. And that's pretty much across the board and goes on into the later hours of the after shows. And that's on broadcast. That's on broadcast. Those channels that used to be trying to get all the eyeballs in the country, they've now decided that the people who are staying up that late are primarily younger people and that this is what they want to hear. And among the students that I have met over the last 5 or 10 years, they are increasingly getting their news from what I would call entertainment sources, such as what I just described, and also programs that are dedicated to comedy and do a lot of political news. There was a show for a number of years, still is, called The Daily Show, but it featured for a number of years Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart, to a large degree, became the news to many of my students. That's where they got their information. And I would say that it was not all necessarily inaccurate information. He had a lot of factual material and he interviewed people from across the political spectrum, but his own political views were no secret. He was clearly very much on the left. So that's where the students were getting their information and where they were getting their entertainment at the same time. So as you say, the two have largely merged, and that too has tended to break down the old presumptions about objectivity, fairness, telling the story as even-handedly as possible.
Joy, I'd like to ask you another question, a different question. During the Reagan administration, Reagan repealed the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine required TV stations to present both sides of political views because they had a license for the airwaves that were owned by the government. That was removed, and now we have very partisan television. Was that a good thing or a bad thing in your view? And anybody else can chime in when Joy is done.
I don't know that I could say that that is good or that's bad. It's, I end up in that's the reality. I actually think the question from Shuyin Zhang in our chat here makes an interesting point. Do you imply that media is not as powerful as it was before? Asking to explain what that impact, that social media impact, and the panoply of voices that have come through the conservative and liberal media, which, I think that we've sort of declared this channel is, Fox News is clearly the more conservative view. MSNBC is, I don't think you could get past thinking that they have most of the liberal voices. The most well-known liberal voices exist in the MSNBC environment. I think CNN has tried to depict itself as walking down the middle, but I think that for commercial purposes, as Professor Alving refers to, I think that the reality and the impact of loosening the reins on something like the Fairness Doctrine just makes it possible for commercial television to do what it needs to do, which is make money. One of the reasons I enjoyed working for Jazeera, frankly, is because at Al Jazeera, we were not dominated by commercial interests. Actually, we sold very little commercial time. And so the outcome of that is that we were not speaking to any commercial interest. We were really focused on what stories do we want to tell. There were other issues around Al Jazeera, but I think just to the point about, the American media is, let's face it, is driven by that commercial dynamic. And that's exactly what Professor Alving laid out. This is the history of the American media. It's driven by its advertising. And because of that, it's going to go to the denominator, the lowest common denominator of producing a large audience, because that's how you make money. And then social media, even if it had not been for this emphasis of the Fairness Doctrine, I think social media would have blown that up anyway. That avenue, that platform allows people and encourages people to have their opinion, hold their opinion, insist that their opinion is correct, and disseminate it, as Mr. Trump does, but as so many others do too. He's just very effective at it. I would also say that, President Trump, I think you could raise the question, is President Trump actually a politician, or is he a member of the media? Because so much of what he does is driven by speaking his voice in these media platforms, whether it's the traditional media platform or whether it's his tweets, as Fred refers to. This is the environment we live in, where the good news is everybody gets a voice. The bad news is you got to hear them all.
So are we dumbing down? Are we, when I was in journalism school many years ago, we were supposed to tell our readers what they needed to know and what they wanted to know. And I don't know if that needed to know stuff it reaches the reaches the audience so strongly anymore. It's like, what do we want to know? What's, it's all kind of gossip and just lots of hyperbole.
Right. We want to hear what we want to hear.
Down.
I think, this concept of fake news, I think I mentioned to you before, Jim, that I felt like the fake news is not a particularly apt description of what people are agitated about. It's not disinformation, which I think is what fake news really should describe. It's not deliberate disinformation. It's just people don't want to hear what they don't want to hear. They want to hear the information they want. That's the substance of their polarization, right? So they want to hear the stuff that endorses their worldview. And because we have all these social channels, because we have highly opinionated talk shows that take up most of the airwaves all day, it's an echo chamber of, I would say, information, but a lot of times it isn't even information. It's just an echo chamber of opinion. And the more you close into your little circle, the worse that's going to get. And I think this
Ron, can you weigh into this?
This is, I think, an enormous problem. It's been called, a social bubble. It's been called an informational bubble. People can choose their own sources of news. They can program their computer to only bring them the things they want to hear, and that it will do, and do very well. And people are looking for audiences that are more niche, more hardcore, more individuated, if you will. They're not looking necessarily to reach everybody. They're just trying to get something that they can count on economically. And now, by the way, I mean, yes, this is all driven largely by money, but it's also true in terms of building audience and holding audience for non-commercial media. I've worked half my career for a nonprofit, public radio entity that supposedly doesn't have to worry about exactly how many people are watching. But the fact of the matter is, of course, all media work around the idea. All of them function. The oxygen of being in the media is attracting and holding an audience. If there's no audience, you're not really even media. You're just keeping a diary. So everyone cares that there be someone out there listening, watching, reading, and we notice what works. So if you are constantly being, careful and fair and educational and maybe a little dull, you're going to feel, let us say, isolated from all those other media sources that are doing everything they can to provoke and entertain and be in some sense or another, impossible to ignore. And Twitter is a wonderful example of this. And you mentioned this earlier, not only the president, but certainly first with the president. It is something that allows him to speak directly to people, and it allows everyone else to speak directly to people. And it allows you to completely circumvent the media. And because all of that is going on, we in the media work all the harder to try to attract audience. And I think that has led us, in some cases, to dumb down, as you say, Jim, but in many other cases, just to emphasize the thing that is most superficially appealing or attractive or provocative.
I remember when the three networks were so strong, CBS Reports would do an investigation of the Pentagon spending, and it would lead to congressional hearings, whatever. And there's still all this great investigative journalism, but it's like a pebble going into the pond, and it ripples a little bit, and then there's another one that going in, and it doesn't get the attention it used to. Let me turn back to the election here. We have some, we're getting some questions in. I want to make sure we address them. Oyang Dadan, what?
This is Fred. I just wanted to say one thing about the fairness doctrine and why we don't need it. And I think Ron has made it pretty clear that, look, all these opinions get out, they get responded to, news stories get responded to. If we had the fairness doctrine, it would dominate. It would dominate the media. It would dominate television because practically every story that goes on, somebody would complain and say, I have to respond to it. And it would be a terrible thing to go back to, and the truth is we don't need it.
Yeah, in today's technology, it just wouldn't work. It might have worked more when there was three networks, but today's technology, no way it will work. I get it. Fred, I'm going to stick with you. We've got a question from Yadan Oyang, who's asking about Biden and Biden's attitude towards China. You've been following Biden for decades. He's being very strong on China. But what will happen if he gets elected? He's got a lot of Hillary's old people, Tony Blinken and many others working for him. I think some of them learned from the days of Obama being quite soft on China. What do you think Biden will do going forward if he's elected?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think a number of Democrats are wondering about why Biden has gotten so strong and critical of Trump on China and critical of China himself, because that's not the attitude he's taken toward China over in recent decades at all. He's been a very, I think, friendly force toward China, and so. I think what he's saying now and attacking Trump will not be the approach he takes if he's elected president. It will not be so strongly critical of China. That would just year after year after year, that has not been Biden's opinion. But look, there's a presidential campaign. He doesn't want Trump to get ahead of him on China, and because China's unpopular now, particularly because of the virus. So he thinks he has to be much stronger toward China for now. As an elected president, I don't think that'll still be the case.
I'm going to stick with you for a minute. You're a conservative columnist. You're a co-founder of the magazine. Bill Kristol is now part of this Never Trumper Lincoln Project. I mean, what's going on with the conservative media? There's and columnists, and actually, the broad spectrum of people. Because Trump is different. I mean, I think there's a lot of discomfort with his behavior and things he says, but then you want to support the party, but there's a split now, and there's a split among the conservative media. I'd like you to, and you wrote a column about the book, The Closing the American Mind, and what's happened at the New York Times editorial page, and Andrew Sullivan leaving New York Magazine. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about that?
Well, there is a division among conservatives in politics about Trump. These are Republicans, and it's been pretty strongly pro-Trump. People like to stay with their party. And there's been a division among people in journalism, particularly at the Weekly Standard, where I worked, and Bill Kristol and I and John Podhoretz, who's now with Commentary, were the founders of the magazine. And Trump is such a force, and people become strongly in favor of him, but for some, Trump is an evil arrival on the scene in politics, that he's a terrible human being. It's not so much his agenda and his ideology, or he doesn't really have an ideology, but he has a lot of issues which he pushes. It's Trump himself, Trump the person, that that the Never Trumpers find to be completely unacceptable. It's I think, a fairly small movement among conservative journalists, and I don't think they've had much of an impact. But we haven't had the election yet, and so they certainly know how to get their criticisms out.
China. It's interesting in China. For all of China's ills that we could talk about all day long, the country is focused and moving ahead. And people are kind of sticking together, moving ahead, where we are so polarized and, well, yelling at each other on cable TV is what really strikes me when I come back here and turn on the TV. I got a question from Su Jiangli. Can the media play a role in building a consensus in the U.S. Instead of leading to polarization? And I'll go back to Ron on this one.
That possibility exists, and there are certainly some media in the United States that would love to play that role. The problem is that they probably wouldn't be able to reach any consensus among themselves. And insofar as they could, there would be too many incentives for people to dissent. I think that there are many different issues at work here, but in salute to some of my colleagues that are conservative journalists and have had a problem with Trump, I don't think it's entirely personal. I don't think it's only his personality, although certainly many of his fans have some problems with his personality, particularly among his evangelical supporters, his white evangelical supporters. They may be embarrassed at some of his personal characteristics, but they're quite wholehearted in embracing his agenda. Among conservatives that I've spoken to, my sense is that what they object to is, in addition to the personality, they're quite concerned about his potential as an autocrat. He does not seem to understand the concept of checks and balances, and he does not seem to have any interest in classic conservative principles. He doesn't seem to really be interested in conservatism as many understood it pre-Trump, and he's much more interested in simply being in charge, in being the boss. He says things such as Article 2 of the Constitution tells me I can do anything I want. That's not the kind of thing that a classic conservative wants to hear. And in fact, many people would say that's the attitude that the Constitution and the Revolution were all about overturning. getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the idea of autocracy. And given the degree to which autocracy is on the march around the world in many countries with extraordinarily strong leaders extending their power indefinitely, this is a real concern for many thoughtful people in this country, and including many, many people on the right.
Can I respond to that? I'd like to respond to that because I think what you have to make a distinction with Trump is between what he says and what he does. And he says things like, I can do whatever I want as president. But does he do what he wants as president? Well, one, he wouldn't be allowed to. And two, he doesn't really try, but he does, he makes, and I think this gets him in trouble and is not helping him get reelected. He makes a lot of outlandish, strong statements. And there's so many of them too, because he's always yakking television or something. But you have to make a distinction between the two. And I don't think it's very hard to tell the difference between what he does and what he says. And so I guess I don't worry about it myself. I know there's some people who do, but follow his agenda and you'll see what Trump's really up to. I don't think he's planning a coup.
Hey, Joy, I'd like to turn to you now. You know, I first went to China in '85, and I moved to the region in '87 to Taiwan, and then I arrived in Beijing in 1990, right after Tiananmen. And America had Chinese people. You would say you were an American, and they would go on and on about how great America was, and this and that. What we've got going on today now, we've talked about public opinion in the U.S. of China, which, by the way, that Pew survey you showed was startling. What's even more startling is Republicans have a much more negative view of China today than Democrats do. I think it's 7 points higher, something like that. But let's go and look at China. And what is the view of America in China, and how is it going to evolve with the darkness of this election and all the anti-China stuff and the racism? And also, we look like a shooting gallery. I mean, Chinese can't imagine, how can everybody here have a long rifle, walk down the street with it? They're worried about their kids coming here. I wonder what the long-term implications of all of that.
You know, on a completely personal level, our son is a college student now in the United States, and I recall going to the introduction, you know, when families first arrive on campus and first-year students and all that. And I was struck by the number of people from East Asia, particularly parents from China, who came to me, looked at me, thought, okay, ABC, we can talk to her, and came running up and asked, is our child safe here? Yeah. Is my child going to be accepted here? Is my child going to be subject to the violence that we see? Is it safe for my child to come to the States? Is it safe for my child to come to college? And at the time, and this is 2 years ago, I was able to say, well, it's not really, college campus is a little bubble, whatever. But I think today there is more legitimate concern, particularly with regard to the anti-Asian violence that we discussed earlier. I think there's more legitimate concern about how people of Chinese descent, whether they are American-born or overseas, I think that there is some legitimate concern about where this is going and how the community will be viewed. And I think that is reaching what I hear people in China saying. I think it's reaching them. I think it's reaching parents. I think it's reaching young people. I think young people are looking to America and hearing from their peers, how are you being treated in America? How are you viewed as a Chinese person in America? I think these are real signs of caution. And I think that messaging or that underlying feeling is somehow reaching back to China. And I think that there is reason for some discomfort in that relationship and discomfort in what's going to happen going forward. whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. I think that, you know, around that concern is already rising, and it's got to be to some extent legitimized.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, let's continue along that line a bit on immigration and visas and talent. You know, there's this administration, perhaps rightly so, actually, has started to really look at American universities and cyber hacking. And, you know, China years ago looked at America and said, hey, this place is open. Let's go vacuum all the information we can out of there. And there were professors over here, some of them assigned by the government and by the military, but a lot of them just smart people that wanted to be professors in America. And now we have the FBI going out and questioning everybody. And that has led to a real chill. And the talent if we lose Chinese talent coming into this country, and I can tell you right now, people that are looking at Australia and Canada and England for their kids to go to school. Even Microsoft is setting up labs in Canada because they want to be in North America, but they can't get visas for engineers and scientists to come in here. Is there a danger this election can just accelerate that and we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot? And I open that to anybody who wants to weigh in.
Ron, I think you probably have quite a few Chinese students too at AU.
Yes, I do. And generally speaking, they are not in the world of STEM. They're not in science and technology. But nonetheless, they're always among the best students that I have. They are always highly talented. And to some degree, I realize that they're the sons and daughters of an elite in China, and that's why they're here in the United States, particularly at a private university. But they are clearly possessed of an agenda, if you will, if you want to call it that, but possessed of an attitude towards the future that is far more mature than the average American 18-year-old or 19-year-old. They know a great deal more about the world. They're sophisticated enough to be multilingual, which relatively few American teenagers ever are. They have a great deal going for them. And I think the general attitude is that as many of them as want to stay in the United States and be part of our community, that we will be the richer for it. That is at least the attitude within academia. And they have been a tremendous boon to American academia, both intellectually and financially. So this is all something that would be a tremendous loss, a tremendous tragedy if it were to attenuate. But at the same time, the general attitude outside of academia is suspicion. And what are they taking away from us? Not what they're adding, but what are they taking away from us? And those questions, of course, been stoked by the current political climate. President Trump has remarkably been able to play the whole China issue in multiple ways. So, for example, one of the main things his administration has tried to do in its first 4 years is renegotiate an arrangement with China whereby they remain a major buyer of American products, particularly agricultural products, want to keep them as trading partners, but want to renegotiate the terms of the trade so that they are more favorable to the United States. And as we've seen, whether they're really that much more favorable or not, they can be portrayed as such. And if someone who has been as famously anti-China or anti-trade with China as the president says, this is a good trade agreement, this is one we should have, now we're back on top, a lot of people are going to buy that without having much independent source of information about whether it's better or worse. So all of those things are factors. My suspicion is that whichever a candidate wins after November, they will pivot to a much more sophisticated relationship with all things China, whether that's the government of China or all of the economics and all the economic actors and elements of China. 1 million jobs are not coming back overnight. Maybe they will over time, but that's not happening overnight. There are complex relationships here that have to be renegotiated over a period of time if they're going to change. So it's going to be what we used to call a whipping boy in this country to talk about China for the next 9 weeks. But after that period of time, realism will still be with us. Our realism will reemerge because the realities of the entire relationship will still be very much with us.
Fred, I got a good one for you.
Okay.
This is an anonymous attendee of the webinar. He said the pandemic he or she, I'm sorry, says the pandemic reveals a lot of things about US people in the eyes of Chinese. For example, irresponsibility, the gap between the rich and the poor, conspiracy groups like QAnon. And then, you know, if you think about it, like my colleagues who I work with in China today are not wearing masks, they're traveling, they're doing business because that system was able to clamp down and isolate in this pandemic. Well, we are, you know, American freedom and don't tell me what to do and don't make me wear a mask is, you know, helping the virus circulate, and that's how Chinese look at it. Like we're kind of off our rocker and irresponsible. So anyhow,
Look,
take it away, Fred.
I find wearing a mask at when it's required not a burden at all. And I'm in the older age group that is more susceptible to being infected. It's a little different if you're a teenager or something because so many of those don't get infected, but older people do. And you know, I really wonder about people who think this is an incredible burden on themselves when you're going out somewhere. And look, most of the stores I see and the post office and so on will say, wear a mask when you come in here and stay 6 feet away. Look, we do have this virus that's still infecting people, and I don't want to get it. I put my mask on.
This is actually a point I hadn't thought of, but one of our questioners is asking about the polls. Can we trust the polls? You know, what's the story on polling? Because does anybody answer their phone anymore and actually answer for a pollster? I never would. I mean, help me here.
You know, it's you know, polls. You just have to. You have to be very dubious of polls, but there's so many of them that you can, and if they're all saying the same thing, then you can probably believe what they're saying. And you know, the polls on the vote itself for the presidency in 2016 were generally correct. I mean, Hillary Clinton did get roughly 3 million more votes for president than Donald Trump did, but they weren't in the right states. We do have the Electoral College, and Trump, you know, drew into an inside straight on that one, and became president. So, but you also have to think about the polls when they change a lot. You know, there's been a poll, I don't know if it's on CNN or somebody, they had Biden ahead of Trump by 4. And then a week later, he was up by 14, Biden was. But then a week after that, he was back to being only ahead by 4. Well, you know, the public hasn't changed that much in just the 2 weeks when those polls were taken. So you have to be dubious about them. And look, I think the worst effect of polls is not how accurate they are, but what they do with politicians. Politicians just are so affected by the polls and in what they say and so on. They don't want to have bad polls. And also, and I say this as someone who writes about politics all the time, it used to be you would go out and say you're covering a Senate race in Iowa, and you just talk to all kinds of people and get a pretty good idea who was ahead and who wasn't, or the state of the race. Now, what is the first thing you're hit with? And it tends to dominate your story about what's going on in that Senate race. You see a few polls. And I like the old way better.
Yeah, David Broder. David Broder was the master of that, wasn't he? Talking to every county election official, and
he would go door to door, and interview voters, and it served him well.
I'm being asked that this is another interesting question here. TikTok. I have my own opinions, but I can see it from many angles because I live in China and I'm an American. But I would like to hear from each of you in this group. What do you think about the president ordering TikTok to be sold to an American company and also getting his cut? What does this mean? Does this mean that if that happens, that then Macron could tell Facebook, sell your Facebook entity in France to us? I mean, what's all this about? I think I'll start. Joy, you've been quiet for a while. I'm going to start with you.
Well, I was really interested in this question, and as the parent of a 20-year-old, I guess maybe I'm particularly attuned to the TikTok question. But it's not just TikTok, of course. It's WeChat, which, of course, is such an important lifeline between those of us here and those of us who communicate with people in China. I think, so on the TikTok thing itself, for any of you who've not seen, I'm sure Fred probably posts a lot of TikToks all day long, because Fred just seems like a TikTok. But if you look at TikTok, you know that it is mostly stupid. I mean, it's not. It's for lack of a better description, it's silliness. There was a view raised in this country that there was an incident where Mr. Trump had a rally in Oklahoma, and people had to get tickets to it, and there was this overwhelming response. Over 1 million people wanted to come to Mr. Trump's rally, and they had all ordered tickets. And then it turned out that actually a very small, well, by comparison, very small group of people actually showed up. And it is said in the social media that this is because teenagers and young people went on through TikTok and rallied sort of a campaign to sign up for Mr. Trump's event, but not with no intention of going, just to kind of flood the registrations with young people who did not have any intention of being at this event. And that's why it ended up looking like a poor showing for Mr. Trump. And the contention is that he was mad about that, and that's what led to the threat of a TikTok ban and the demands that it be sold to an American company. But you and I and everyone knows that even if TikTok were to vanish from the face of the earth, it would take about an hour for another app to rise in its place. So it's not that. And I don't truly believe that Mr. Trump is lying in his bed at night worrying about what's going on TikTok. I do think that it has much more to do with this presence of technologies that originate in China, but that are, from Mr. Trump's point of view, should be profitable to American companies if they're going to make money off of American participants in the use of them. And so I think
I'd ask any of the other participants to give a short answer on this if you would like, and then we're going to be signing off here. We're running towards the end of time.
TikTok.
Just say, just briefly, that the president's willingness to say things such as he has said about TikTok, and they're going to have to do this and they're going to have to do that, and try to get involved in trying. Similarly with Kodak, we won't go into that story, but similarly with Kodak, the president getting involved in private transactions and private enterprise in that way is what disturbs some people who otherwise would probably have no problem with his general agenda.
Fred?
Well, I agree on the whole TikTok thing. He needs to butt out. It sounds like some corrupt banana republic saying, if you want to do business here, you have to slip me some money. And the head of that country saying that. I think Trump, he may think it's a fun thing to do, but it's made a mess. I see in the Wall Street Journal today, the headline is Chinese rules cloud TikTok deal. Well, look, if the president's horning in, well, then there's going to be a response by China.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole TikTok thing, where TikTok is split from its parent company that's close to the Chinese government and so on. And but it's now Trump is one of the leaders that has caused just so many problems with it that it probably won't happen. A sale of TikTok to one of these many American companies that would like to buy it.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap this up now. I'd like to thank AmCham. I'd like to thank USCT. I'd like to thank our incredible panelists. And I'm going to editorialize just for a second at the end, because I want to pick up on something Joey said on anti-Asian American racism that is on the rise. This is the Chinese are the only ethnic group to be banned by law from the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect for 70 years. It came in, what year was it? 1882, and it lasted till 1952. Chinese were banned from immigrating to the United States because American labor got worried about these people and building the railroads and working in the West, that they worked too hard and they took too little money and they were going to overwhelm American labor. And in some ways, what we're doing today on China is, we're so worried about them overwhelming us in terms of business. My advice is we should compete. But there's a lot of people on this call that are journalists and other influential people. You have to push back on this anti-Asian racism. You can't let it get out of control. So anyhow, I wanted to add that. Thank you, everybody. It's been great. And nice to see you all. And our panelists were fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye-bye.
The audience.
Take care.